Hey, hello, welcome to lecture number 3, I believe. Today's topic is going to be on command economies, the origins of them, history of organizations, and everything else. Today joins us is Cyrano. She's on top of the mirror. So without further ado, let's kick it. Here's a little fun game. Can you name all the economists on here? If you can, you get, I don't know, bonus points. I'll heart your comment and pin it, I guess. All right. The actual beginning of the lecture. History of exchange. Whenever Aristotle was first studying the economy, he said that before currency existed, there was bartering. This is the very conventional view. If you ever go into any economics course, this is what they're going to teach you. It's that if person A wanted something and person B wanted something, then hopefully they each had goods the other person wanted, or else there would be no exchanging of goods. And eventually you would have this large web of goods of goat meat and apples and fur skins and everything, and they would somehow be able to trade amongst themselves so that they were capable of coming out on top with exactly what they wanted. And if you can tell from a little corner over there, we're going to say why bartering is completely wrong. Actually, it's over in this direction. And that comes from David Graeber. I'm not the biggest fan of him in the world, but in this case, I believe he's right. So, the actual history of money. Let's get to it. Post-Keynesians said that, unlike the bartering, that command economies were centrally always there. Within a community, you did not have someone bartering for a certain good. Instead, they would just take that good, and they would assume that in return that some other service be provided for them, or that some other good would be provided. It was this system of debt that everyone in the community had amongst each other that allowed them to constantly operate as socially efficient people. And that the origins of currency weren't out of people just suddenly out of nowhere appraising gold to be valuable, but instead it was something that was actually organized. The Graeber uses this one example of if you have 1,000 soldiers and you're trying to feed 1,000 soldiers, what's the best way to go about it? Is it to try to procure bread and water for every single one of them individually, or do you pay each of them a salary and they each get a gold coin, and then you make a tax on all of your citizenry and say that they each need to get a gold coin by the end of the year in order to not be arrested? And so suddenly the citizenry, they all start thinning out their markets, and they all try to get gold coins from each other or from the soldiers in order to pay off the debts that have just been given to them. And so what Graeber is really saying here is that this creation of currency is the creation of debt, because in order to make people care about currency, you have to make them indebted in some way so that they're willing to start trading these resources around. And once people are in debt, then they're willing to amass the things that can pay off their debts, and that becomes something valuable to them. To give an actual historical example, within Vietnam, American soldiers were heading over and they were only being given receipts in IOU papers instead of actual USD. And so they would head off to these bars and inns and several other places with only IOU papers. And whenever it came time to pay their tabs, they would just give them these receipts of debt. And eventually the Vietnamese bar owners would take that as just as valuable as the USD itself, and they would begin trading it amongst themselves, and that became more important than the actual Vietnamese currency, because that was strong. It was going to be paid back by the US government eventually. However, never once was any of those receipts ever paid off, and yet you can still find remnants of those receipts being valuable because they had the perceived value of them, of eventually they would be paid off. It was this central authority giving their trust in order to establish that this was something worthwhile and that you could really give this to someone and obtain beer in return. And that's the most important thing whenever it comes to any sort of human interaction, is this worth a pint? Now, inevitably, once money is created, you have to actually ask yourself, well then, how do you organize it? Do you still go from this top to bottom, or what? Well, this comes in with our good friend Hayek. Spoilers to some of the answer from earlier, if you're smart enough to pay attention. And Hayek says that there is one core economic problem, and it is the problem of the utilization of knowledge not given to anyone in its totality. And what does he mean by that? Well, Hayek is saying that the actual problem of the economy is how you organize it. And the way you organize it is by the information given to you. Because inevitably it must be organized, and you can either choose to organize it from a center or from the individual. So essentially, as many centers as possible. And because not every single, because of the lack of information given to these planning centers in the Politburo, then inevitably the individual is the one who should be at the core of planning. Here's a little taste of what Nick Land has to say on the situation. I'm sure you are all infinitely interested.
There is a very similar pattern that you find in the structure of societies, in the structure of companies, and in the structure of computers. And all three are moving in the same direction. That is, away from a top-down structure of a central command system, giving the system instructions about how to behave, towards a system that is parallel, that is flat, which is a web, and which change moves from the bottom up. And this is going to happen across all institutions and technical devices. It's the way they work.
What the hell? Anyway, let us get on to continuation of the lecture. Sorry, I broke my mouse, so I'm trying to keep it in use. So, as was being said, you had these structures specifically moving from top to bottom. The individual became more important within the organization of everything once money came into the equation, because they became in charge more of their own lives instead of purely being allotted a certain amount of time or be given food or housing from a top structure and then them having their free roam within that. But instead, whenever they are granted money, then it becomes their own decisions on picking out these specific places that they would use their money. Instead of buying from the company store, you buy from a large selection of various companies. It's this moving from top to bottom. Now, what grants the individual the knowledge that they have? Well, Hayek says that there is really two types of knowledge. There's the scientific and there's the tacit. And here's a little quote about tacit knowledge itself, and it's, "Today, it is almost heresy to suggest that scientific knowledge is not the sum of all knowledge, but a little reflection will show you that there is beyond question a body of very important but unorganized knowledge which cannot possibly be called unscientific, or called scientific. And it is this non-statistically organizable knowledge that exists that central planners do not have access to. It's these inherent biases when people. It's this skill that they have, the immediate thing that they can pick out and know of a product. It's their gut feelings and intuitions that are completely immeasurable, but need to be measured in order to appropriately organize an economy. And thus, without the individual as the decider, Hayek states that there can be no proper organization of any sort of large-scale economic society. To kind of give a different perspective on this organizational system, we can talk about Coase theorem and theoretical perfection. Now, going back to this barter system, was it ever possible? Well, if you give these very, very specific laws, then it might just be. So, within a system of perfect knowledge, Pareto efficiency is possible. Pareto efficiency meaning that no other trade can occur without bringing down the value or efficiency of trades. No one would prefer one thing over another. That is Pareto efficiency. And so under these four rules, or laws, and that is property rights must be clearly defined. There must be little to no and generally no transactional costs. There must be few affected parties if there are transaction costs, and organization of them cannot be expensive at all. There must be no wealth effects. The efficient solution will be the same regardless of who gets the initial property. The Coase theorem shows that the essence of the market is not the price, but property rights themselves. As long as there are property rights, people naturally negotiate a reasonable price. He won the Nobel Prize for this in 91, I believe. And so what does that last sentence mean, which is the most important? It's that whenever you have an economy, the price is not the thing that matters, but it is the property rights that matter. It's the fact that I own this and you own that, and our relationships between wanting to trade those is the thing that matters the most. Because price, aka value, it's not a fixed thing as pi is 3.14. It is that these two people have agreed upon one thing. A buyer and a seller have agreed that something is worth this exact amount, and that is value, and that is price. And the exact organization of those thousands and thousands of buyers and sellers organizing one specific thing inevitably becomes the organizational venue of a free market. Those inherent biases that create it. And so the Coase theorem says that given zero transactional costs in defined property rights, that Pareto efficiency is completely possible to obtain. So let's shift gears a little bit here. Eventually everything's going to start coming to make sense, but we can come out with... So let's talk a little bit about those top-down structures of currency to governments, and that's feudalism. So first, you have the noble, the owner of the property, going to the peasant, of deciding the quotas of how much grain should be produced, how much food they have, how much work they need to be doing on the farm. And it isn't until you have the bourgeoisie revolution and the creation of firms and these proper guilds that you see the overthrowing of these top-down structures and the movement towards the bottom-up structures. And specifically, these bourgeois revolutions saw that people had money and the will and freedom to impose their own desires upon their social governance. The private citizen now operates with the same authority in regards to wealth distribution as the noble. Sure, they might have less, but they are just as capable of deciding what to spend their money on, which previously was not possible at all. And so we see central planning as a return to this sort of feudalistic position as opposed to the newfound free markets of Western Europe. It's these ideas of quota creation and meeting without specifically defined values that we see among these new centrally planned governmental styles. And so let's talk about that in specifics with the Soviet Union. Now, how do you define these goods? Because previously we were defining grains, but that was still within a free market structure, or free market. They still had values, they were worth some amount of gold, but whenever you run currency completely out of the equation, how are you going to define how much of something that you need? First, they said, we would like, let's go with the factory of screws. They said, we'll have this certain mass of screws. We want this amount of tonnage. Well, whenever you make a screw, you make it huge, you make it weigh a ton, and you make it really crude. And inevitably, once they end up with all those screws, they think to themselves, well, that's not right. We don't want this type of screw. We want quantity. And so they said, we want this many thousands of screws. So suddenly, those screws are incredibly light. They're not sturdy at all. They break super easily, but they have way more. Inevitably, it becomes a game of specifications and the bureaucratic process of more and more laws and rules to be set in place to define the screw, to define exactly what you need in order to have your company produce that specific product so that it will work later on the lines in whatever tank production that you have. And so having this happen with every single type of good makes this incredibly rigorous bureaucratic process. If you ever heard anything about Stalin, it's his incredible attention to detail in running the Soviet Union because of how much of a bureaucracy it was. So much central planning is necessary in order to understand, well, how much a quota needs to be, its historical relevancies, all the graphs necessary in order to make anything relevant, just because you don't have currency as a part of the equation. Let's talk about that quota system. Well, if you have one firm, or I guess one factory, and you say, I want this many tonnage of screws or quantity or whatever they ended up going with, well, you have this very specific pressure to meet those quotas, because if you don't, you're probably going to go to the gulag. And inevitably, once you make and break the quota, then you will get your allotted bonus that you'll receive, but next year, you'll get a higher quota. And so, to avoid these higher and higher and exponentially higher quotas, people would stop working for the first 3 months. And then they would they would talk with their factory managers, and they would say, there's no way we can ever meet this previous quota. You need to lower our quota. And inevitably, they would lower it. And because the inputs, all these screws, would not have started within the first 3 months, all the tanks would say, hey, we're 3 months behind schedule, you need to lower our quotas. And across the entirety of the Soviet system, quotas were dropped so low that they would immediately be broken and the bonus would be handed out, and it would become this game of every single year, quotas would drop super low, and they would rise super high because they would break them. And you would have this constant flux of the theoretical output and productivity of the Soviet Union because there was never any firm numbers on anything because the statistics were always out of whack. Now, to put in briefly a question on wages and labor slips, people would sometimes go months without pay, but they would still somehow show up to work. Granted, they were not efficient. They'd be breeding cats and playing speed chess all day, but they would still show up to work. There are cases in which 2 months would go by and workers would hound their bosses and yet never receive labor slips. Granted, they were fed, but this is something that really never could have happened within any sort of Western system in which pay is mandatory. And frankly, I don't understand how it's possible that people would show up without getting paid. That is a completely uniquely Soviet thing. But let's talk about this efficiency, because we have this in perfection, but what were they capable of producing? Well, you may not trust Soviet numbers, so let's get from their biggest enemy over there in Germany. And this comes from the Mannerheim Hitler conversation, and where they talk with complete freedom of not believing that they were being reported.
Tja, das ist wirklich eine sehr große Gefahr, vielleicht die schwerste. Der ganze Umfeld hat das jetzt alles so übernommen. Wir wussten das selber auch nicht so ganz genau, wie ungeheuerlich diese Strafaufrüstung war.
Das hätten wir nicht geahnt im Winterkrieg. Im Winterkrieg hätten wir das nicht geahnt. Natürlich hatten wir den Eindruck, dass sie gut gerüstet waren. Aber so, wie sie im Wirklichen. Und jetzt ist ihm gar kein Zweifel, was sie hatten in ihren Schienen.
Ganz klar.
Das ist
Sie haben die ungeheuerste Rüstung, die Menschen denkbar ist. Also, wenn mir jemand gesagt hätte, dass ein Staat mit Wenn mir jemand gesagt hätte, dass ein Staat mit 35.000 Tanks antreten kann, dann hätte ich gesagt, sie sind Wahnsinn. 35.000 Panzer. Wir haben zurzeit über 34.000 Panzer vernichtet. Wenn mir das jemand gesagt hätte, ich hätte gesagt, Und wenn ein General von mir erklärt hätte, dass hier im Staat 35.000 Panzer dieser Ziele halten, Sie sehen alles doppelt oder zehnfach. Das ist Wahnsinn, Sie sehen Gespenster. Das haben wir nicht für möglich. Wir haben ja vorher erzählt, wir haben Fabriken gefunden. Allein eine da in Kramaroskaya zum Beispiel. Das war vor 2 Jahren Bau und wir hatten keine Ahnung. Heute ist dort eine Panzerfabrik, die in der ersten Schicht der etwas über 30.000 und in dem Vollausbau über 60.000 Arbeiter beschäftigen soll. Eine einzige Panzerfabrik. Wir haben sie besetzt. Eine gigantische Fabrik. Arbeitermassen, die allerdings über die Tiere leben. Im Donetsk-Gebiet.
Ja, wenn man denkt.
So let's talk a little bit about what else that they were producing, as well as their tanks and armament. And with that, we can talk about the pre-Soviet and post-Soviet economy, where we have this slow exponential gain of their coal, and then in the 1930s to the 1940s, this immense lapping of coal output. And so this is to say that it isn't necessarily the Soviets' condition that pushed them towards how much manufacturing of coal that they're capable of, but it is possible that under the Romanov family and the Tsarist regime that they could have reached the numbers that they did, but that even though they had these imperfections, these numbers were still completely possible. Here is an example of comparing them to other Allied nations, where in yellow the Soviet Union experienced this very, very minor exponential curve until 1914, and then you have the drop-off. And then under the initial collectivization period until the new economic policy, the NEP of Lenin, then you have this rapid expansion of coal production within the Soviet Union throughout the periods of the 20s to the 30s, and then eventually in the 1940s. And that is something that has really not been replicated. Yes, you have other countries that have done something quite somewhat similar, like such as the United States with our oil production, but to see a country go from really a backwater, non-productional, non-industrialization to this complete rapid expansion, it has really never been done before within this sort of scale, and complete with this sort of command economy. So in reality, the point that I'm trying to get across here is, even though there were the imperfections that we saw earlier with the quotas and this nut and bolt problem, they were still capable of making 35,000 tanks before the war. And they were still capable of rapidly expanding their coal mine production. It's just a matter of their total efficiency and total one-mindedness that exclusively central production allows you to have. That was Lecture 3. Thank you for listening. And I'll see you for Lecture 4 or any sort of future project. Thank you.